Hellhounds, chase ghosts, come sleep, watch out, demons are coming, run, sleep, hide, spirits, ghosts, hide, demons, hellhounds, ghosts, demons are coming, spirits, ghosts.
Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we have 3 scary stories to sink our hellish teeth into. If you have any scary stories or true encounters you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Also, if you like this content, then don't forget to subscribe. And if you would be so kind and click that like button, that would be very much appreciated. Now, let's get right into it. Hell is real. Posted by Bloody Spaghetti. This isn't paranoia, not in the slightest. This isn't even any kind of anxiety. Something is attempting to disturb my peace. Something or someone is trying to drive me insane, but I will not let it happen. I am a man of faith, and I have the utmost faith in God and His plan for me. I am certain that in the worst case scenario, God is testing me. It is a great honor to be worthy, to be challenged by our Father who is in heaven. Perhaps it's not even a test. Perhaps it's a premonition waiting to happen. Maybe I'm just feeling a messenger of God walking beside me. Perhaps all of this is just an angel waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to me. I might be a prophet for all I know. I am not entirely sure I want to be a prophet, because it's a hefty duty and a cruel fate in our times. People are borderline idolatrous and refuse to accept the love of our Lord upon themselves. People would ostracize me as a mad or dangerous man if I revealed myself as a prophet. No, that can't be the case. Thinking about it, I might be a victim of a demon of Satan. An angel would not conceal itself in the darkness. An angel is a being of light. Whatever is present around me is definitely cold and is a being of empty blackness. It all started a few months ago. I started having these strange dreams in which I am roaming a desolate city. A great fire engulfed the dream city and unimaginable screams and cries echoed all over me. I simply roamed this apocalyptic town aimlessly, lost, and yet walking around with a purpose. Dreams are strange like that. There was one thing truly out of place in these dreams. I felt the presence of something following me at all times, almost breathing into my neck. But I was too hesitant to turn around and look back. Something was preventing me from turning back. Something internal, a fear of sorts. Waking up after those dreams, cold sweat covered my body, mixed in with the feeling of tiredness. At some point, sleep became scarce because of these dreams. My mind wouldn't even let me sleep, dreading internally the dreams, the presence. I became irritable and irrational, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if there was someone right behind me. My blood ran cold, my body turned dull and aching. The presence followed me in my waking hours too. I was constantly feeling someone was following my every step, mimicking my movements to a T. The breaking point came when I felt an icy hand caress the top of my head. It was a soft, subtle touch that moved along my scalp. I froze. My body became stone for a split second before the sensation dissipated and I screamed. Falling backward from my chair, my heart exploded and pins and needles prickled my skin all over. I just laid there for what felt like a few moments that stretched into an infinity before finally getting up to my feet. My stomach was twisting itself in knots. My whole body shook with fear. Frantically, I looked around the house, but I was all alone. The realization that my mind might have been playing tricks on me didn't make me feel any better. My mind was eating itself, and my heart was shriveling in terror at what I was becoming. After finally calming down, I slumped into my couch to burn a few brain cells watching TV, watching some late night comedy. I caught something in the window. Someone was walking by my yard. Nothing unusual. Turning my head back to the television, I barely caught the greyish flesh flying toward my window. Jerking my head towards the window again, I saw him standing there, a figure concealed by darkness, standing with his side facing the window. My heart rate rose. I slowly got up and walked towards the window. The figure's head made a sharp turn to me. I fell onto the floor. That face, it was the face of death. At that moment I realised that hell is real. At that moment I saw hell. I've seen it. My body froze in terror as that thing merely stared at me. Through the window, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't move. It was getting hard to breathe while that thing just stood there, its neck twisted awkwardly. I prayed. I begged. I pleaded for God's mercy. I pleaded for salvation. The demon stood there, its ghastly smile growing wider with each passing moment. Its face was sickly pale, an eyeless visage. Inside of the eyes, fires flickered in the empty-bodied sockets. An inhumanely enormous smile stretched from one ear to the other, filled with some decaying teeth, while missing many others. The obvious lack of fluids stretched the skin awfully, and the cavity emanated smoke where the nose should have been. A few dirty strands of hair sat on top of the exposed scalp, swinging gently in the wind. Hell is real, and this was its face. I remained on the floor begging and pleading for mercy from the demon and God, but the beast just stood there, unmoving, before pressing its bloody hand onto the window. Its arm bent grotesquely. Then it turned itself and disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't move from the floor for a while after the thing had disappeared. I fell asleep on the floor, suffering from terrible nightmares of a man being stabbed repeatedly. His dying screams echoed in my ears long after I had woken up. The bloody handprint the demon smeared on my window was still there in the morning after. It wasn't a dream, and ever since that day I've been living in a crippling terror. I can barely sleep because whenever I try to sleep, my mind looks for that demon again in the darkness, driving me anxious and keeping me awake. When my body finally shuts down, I suffer from terrible nightmares of demonic torture and rape of bloating and decaying corpses. I can barely eat because my body is so messed up. The constant stress has shattered my psyche. I keep feeling someone around me at all times, standing over me, looming. I am constantly cold because I'm so on edge and my skin feels like pins and needles ceaselessly prick it. I am losing my mind. I am losing my will. I am losing my faith. Father, please help me. Hosanna, deliver me. Save me from this Satan that is trying to torment my soul and damn me to all hells. The devil appeared in the mirror. It appeared in my mirror. I was looking at my reflection, my mind losing its touch with reality, consumed by exhaustion and fear. I was falling asleep on my feet. My reflection appears to be ghastly enough. I haven't left the house in a few weeks, and as a result, I have lost a lot of weight. I am looking like a walking dead man. The reflection started bubbling and twitching. My heart seized up and my vision refocused itself. The spectral presence plucked me out from the pleasant tranquility between wakefulness and sleep. The reflection in the mirror started bleeding from all over its body, like someone had stabbed it in multiple places. The eyes burned out and the teeth decayed, and most of them fell out. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. Something was forcing me to gaze upon the devil as it took over my mirror. The room grew cold. My heartbeat pounded in my ears like a demon drum. I heard the beast cackle as its smile grew wider. Maggots fell out of its grotesque maw. I stood there, locking eyes with flaming sockets, my heart trying to escape out of my chest. Its bloody hands rose and pushed through the mirror as if it were nothing but a translucent fabric veil. They slowly inched toward me. A lump rose in my throat, slowly stifling me. The ghastly hands made their way towards me until they finally grabbed the sides of my head. The cold sensation of my dry, dead skin touching my head made me scream, but that only made things worse. Before I could do anything, the demonic hands slammed my head into the mirror hard. A sharp pain shot through my skull and a warm liquid flowed down my face. Everything started turning dull and dark until darkness engulfed me. When I came to, I saw myself standing over two people fighting. A hooded man straddled over another man before stabbing him. The knife tore through skin and muscle tissue with a sickening sound. A primal cry escaped the victim's mouth. Then silence. The violence didn't stop. The sickening sound of flesh being struck broke the silence. My stomach twisted, and a burning rage filled up my insides. I wanted to do something, but quickly realised I couldn't. I ran towards the men, but as my hand reached out to the knife-wielding one, my hand passed straight through him. This was just a vision of sorts. The stabbing didn't stop. He kept puncturing his long-dead victim's body again and again, 66 times. Then he finally dropped his knife and fell beside his victim. His clothes, face and hands, all of it blood-soaked. He was drowning in blood. The scene made me sick. I felt the tears streaming down my cheeks. What a monster would do such a thing to a fellow man. I wanted to see his face. I needed to see his face. I had to know who this monster was. When I finally saw it, the feeling of a knife piercing my heart echoed through my body. A cinder block fell onto my chest. The sensation knocked the air out of me, and I couldn't breathe. I stood there, dreading the face below me. My head spun, and everything faded away again. I woke up on the floor of my room. The mirror was cracked, my face bloodied and tears streaming down my eyes. It was hard to breathe. My body just refused to accept the oxygen. My head was spinning like crazy. Every fibre in my body screamed agony. The thing in the mirror was still there, still laughing, still mocking me, flashing out its multiple stab wounds, 66 in number. I stared at the mirror, looking directly at the thing, looking back at me. A ghost from a long forgotten past, a ghost from a night buried deep underneath the consciousness. It mouthed something at me, and I understood exactly what it said. Looking at my hands, I saw the red. I saw blood. It wasn't my own. No matter how many times I've washed my hands, I cannot get the blood off. The devil is still here, still haunting me, and preventing me from having peace of mind or rest, with its cold, dead touch, or its blood-curdling shrieks. It's always here. It's always haunting and tormenting me. My strength is waning. The beast keeps making its demand. I can't bring myself to fight it any longer. I can no longer resist its influence. Father, please forgive me, for I have sinned. I've killed a man, Father. I've killed a man. In a fit of drunken rage, I've killed a man. Stabbed him 66 times. Now his vengeful and restless spirit is torturing me and tearing my soul in odd directions. One night at the shelter, posted by Erucius. I've worked at the homeless shelter in my town for about 7 years. In 7 years I've done just about everything at the shelter. Cooked the food, cleaned the toilets, set up and run the AA meetings, security work and been glorified babysitter more nights than I can count. In all that time though, I've come to care for the people who wander in looking for a dry place to sleep and a warm bed for the night. I know everyone who works the night shift says it, but the night shift at the shelter is different from the day shift. The day shift, 6 AM to 6 PM, staffs 8 kitchen helpers and a chef, though it's less 5-star chef and more Waffle House fry cook. 5 on-staff therapists, a doctor and 3 nurses for the medical facility, and 6 staff members who do everything from answer the phones to clean the toilets. During the day, this place might as well be a Howard Johnson, but at night it may as well be a youth hostel. The night shift has 5 employees, a cook and a kitchen helper, who are both gone by 10. A nurse who mostly tries to keep everything stable until morning, and 2 staffers who keep the place from falling apart. Strange way to do things, I know, but management figures that at night the residents should be sleeping and thus need less care. In all that time I've been here, I've broken up many fights, held a lot of people's hands while they puked, waited on ambulances while someone had a seizure and went into convulsions, and herded scared residents into the hallway while someone went through violent DTs and ripped the dorm apart. I've also seen a small group of residents put on a production of The Christmas Story, seen them exchange gifts under the tree on Christmas, throw a regular resident a surprise birthday party, and help each other through the loss and pain. The homeless community is a lot more tight-knit than anyone would ever believe, and despite its many problems, I have never had an incident like I did on the night when this story takes place. On the night all hell broke loose. It happened 3 weeks ago, December 18th, and I just walked out of a nasty blizzard. The weather was never what I'd call good, but today's weather was a killer. I crunched in around 6 in the evening and said hi to Janice, who was at the front desk that night. She looked up from Candy Crush long enough to give me a half-hearted wave, which I returned before heading to the cafeteria. Dinner service was just starting up, so I put on my apron and helped out. Chad, the shelter cook, doesn't like non-kitchen staff in the kitchen area, so I bypassed the back and took a spot on the line, where I passed out bowls of soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. I greeted some familiar faces, talked to some people I knew for a few minutes, and scanned the room for my regulars. There are many faces you know in a shelter, and those were faces I was looking for. I saw Lou and Chuck sitting around a table that was packed with other drifters. Chuck telling a long and exciting story to a crowd of homeless, and stopped long enough to wave at me. When he saw me looking, Lou waved too, smiling, and Chuck went back to telling his story, while Lou, a classic example of a city vagrant. Chuck was what we called a traveller. He'd been here for a few months, said he liked the architecture of our town, but before that he claimed to have been most everywhere. I've picked oranges in Florida for 50 cents a crate. I've bought in Idaho spuds for $2 a bag. I've worked in greasy spoon diners and driven cabs in New York City, and I'm here to tell ya, girl, that I've seen just about everything this great nation has to offer. Probably saved a bundle by seeing it on my own 2 pins too, he'd said as he slapped his legs and cackled. He and Lou have pulled around for a while, and I like to see someone looking out for Lou. As a recovering heroin addict, he doesn't always remember things so well, and if someone like Chuck or Lenny are looking out for him, he's less likely to stumble out into traffic or hunt for a needle again. As though summoned by the thought of his name, Lenny came stomping right about then, and gave me his trademark Lenny smile, which showcased all 5 of his teeth. Evening, Miss Lisa. How's your night going so far? I didn't immediately respond though. Someone in the back had caught my eye. He looked like a mall Santa who had come in for a bite before his shift, and it was certainly the right time of year for him. He wore a dark red cap, had a long white beard that hung to his waist, dressed in an old red ski jacket, and topped it off with a pair of scuffed black motorcycle boots. He sat in the back with his meal, and I could see the end of a gnarled wooden stick leaning against a wall within easy reach. He had a big old stained travel sack perched on it, and it only enhanced the idea that this was Santa Claus. Lenny looked back to where I was looking for a minute before trying to bring me back to reality. You know that old man, Ms. Lisa? He asked, genuinely curious. I shook my head. No, Lenny, I don't think I've ever seen him before, have you? Lenny shook his head in a slow and deliberate way. No, ma'am. I guess he must be an out-of-towner, like old Chuck there, he said as he pointed at Chuck, who was now miming a fishing net that he was yanking up from somewhere. I gave Lenny his food and made small talk. He responded with his usual sermon. He had woken up, gotten dressed, and he and Lou had gone to a panhandle on their favourite corner. They had left before noon, since that's when the cops usually come around, eaten lunch at the shelter, then spent the afternoon looking for cans or bottles to recycle. Each of these pronouncements contained a "by Jesus" or "by the grace of God, Amen." And Lenny was a firm believer in the power of God, and believed that his mercy was the reason he was still alive today. A staunch atheist I may be, but I wasn't about to dampen his spirit. I gave him an extra grilled cheese, and he went over to sit with his friends. After dinner service, most of the residents went to the activity room to watch TV, or hung out in the dining hall to talk. I took this opportunity to visit one of my friends in medical before it was time to call lights out. The medical door sits right across from the welcome desk, where Janice still sat with her phone as she had earlier. I ducked in and received a nod from Miss Chasterley, our resident night nurse. As I said hello to some of my other residents, Ms. Chasterley and I have a lot in common, at least in my mind, when it comes to working at the shelter. She's a retired school nurse with 5 years of nursing school before discovering her passion for teaching. Her job is to put a band-aid on it or keep things from going to hell until the doctor gets here in the morning. In many ways, I have the same responsibilities. I've always seen us as soldiers in the same war, and I think she senses that when we talk. John was in the back. His legs were still wrapped up, and he was covered in quite a few blankets as the IV dripped him full of warmth. John was one of the residents I had hoped to get off the street, and before his accident I thought I had succeeded. He had been an engineer before his wife left him, and his depression had caused him to slip into a dangerous spiral that had ultimately landed him on the streets. When I found out about his background, I had started trying to help him find a job to get back on his feet. When a local factory needed machinists, John had agreed to give it a try. Then 2 weeks ago he dropped off the face of the earth. I'd almost given up on finding him again when the hospital called me 2 days ago. He'd given them my name just before they were going to kick him out, and I helped him get to the shelter so he could recover. It turns out he and 5 other homeless guys had been caught out in the blizzard and nearly froze to death under the east side overpass. His legs had some frostbite on them, but thanks to the hospital he was recovering nicely. Thanks to the shelter he'd been able to finish recovering without being turned back out into the blistering cold. He greeted me and we talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. I asked him about his recovery, and he said he thought he'd be better in a few days. He asked me if I'd heard from the factory about the job, and I told him they were understanding after I explained the circumstances. They had asked me to get in touch with them after John felt better, and I told them we certainly would. John thanked me for working so hard for him, and after a little more small talk, I excused myself to check on the dorms. Had I stayed any longer, I wouldn't be alive to tell this story. I'd left medical and was going into the dormitory area where I heard the front door open. I felt a blast of cold run across my back, and I turned to see who'd come in out of the chill. I felt myself stiffen as I saw them, 3 men in overcoats with huge scarves covering their mouths. And though I couldn't have told you why at that time, they struck me as wrong. Their posture made me think of something not quite human. They crouched way of standing you sometimes see in primates, and the way they held their heads made me think their faces had an odd longness to them. They hadn't seen me yet, and their attention was focused on Janice as she rose to greet them. She got up and walked towards them, asking them to sign in and brandishing a clipboard at them. That was when one of them reached out and broke her neck. Now I don't mean that he used ESP or telekinesis or anything like that. When I say he reached out and broke her neck, what I mean is that his hand moved too fast for me to see, and Janice fell with her head twisted all the way around. He hadn't moved except for his hand, and she suddenly went from being alive to being dead in the space of 2 seconds. As her body crumpled to the floor, her killer made a muffled sound like a cat's yowl and ripped the scarf off his face. Underneath, its face was with no colour or static, and his skin seemed to crawl like an army of dead white ants. His face opened and his mouth elongated like a snake dislocating its jaw as it fell on her and started tearing her clothes off. It ripped them open like you or I might tear the wrapper off a candy bar, and bent his face down as it bit into her. It pulled and tore chunks of meat away with hungry feral bites, and didn't chew the meat so much as the meat dissolved when it came in contact with its skin. I know that's a lot to process, and it sounds like it might take a while, but this whole exchange took less than a minute from beginning to end. 1 minute Janice was getting up to ask the strangers to sign in, and a minute later she was being chewed on like an animal in a National Geographic film, while I stood there frozen to the spot. I know that makes me sound like a coward, but I couldn't help it. The scene before me was so alien and shocking that my mind almost couldn't process it. As the killer hunched, eating, its friends turned and headed into the medical area. Miss Chasterley said something as they came in, but it was drowned out as the whole room erupted in shouts of terror mixed with breaking furniture and alien yowls. Then the thing looked up, noticing me for the first time. The sight of his strange face and sewing needle teeth moved me to action. I turned and ran through the double doors that led to the dorm and slammed them shut behind me. I slammed my fist into the big red button on the wall and sighed as the maglocks on the door engaged. The state required us to install them on the door to medical and dormitory doors, which led to the back office. Since both areas contained confidential files, we had to have a way to secure them, and what better way than magnetic locks that exert 1,000 pounds of pressure. I put my back against the door, knowing that thing couldn't get in and that I'd be safe until they left or police arrived. Knowing that, I still screeched when it hit the door hard enough to rattle it in the frame. The residents started coming out then, and the corridor was filled with the sounds of running feet and raised voices. Before I knew it, I had 20 upset people behind me when Lenny put a hand on my shoulder. I jumped to the ceiling. His face was ashen, and I could tell that he'd caught a glimpse of the hallway beyond. He opened his mouth, probably to ask what was going on, when a inhuman scream pierced the hallway and something hit the glass on the door hard enough to send cracks running through it. That worried me because that glass is supposed to stop a bullet. The first bullet, at least. This thing had just cracked it with a single hit. The second hit bulged it grotesquely inwards, and the third turned it into a square of broken glass and twisted metal rods. An arm scrambled through the breach and began hunting for a latch. "Lisa, get back!" someone yelled, and I saw Chuck run forward with a fire extinguisher in hand. He slammed the butt of the canister into the arm, but it did no more damage to it than the shards of glass on the door did. The arm continued to rake around, searching for some way inside. When Chuck brought the canister down for a third hit, it finally seemed to register. It swiped out with the long nails on its hand, and the canister parted easily and sprayed clouds of foam and air. Chuck let it go and threw the sputtering thing at the arm, backtracking. As he moved towards the group, he turned to me then, and I suddenly realised that they were all looking at me, looking for me to guide them out of this situation. I almost laughed at them. What part of this did they think was in the homeless shelter management book? There was no protocol for being set upon by a group of monsters who ignore the laws of nature and do whatever they want. They wanted me to help them, but I doubted that anyone could help them. We weren't people to those things out there. We were that troublesome bit of food that won't come out of the can. We were trapped in here, and it was only a matter of time before they knocked down the doors, maglocks or not, and turned this hallway into a slaughterhouse. I felt my knees wanting to come up to my chest and my body longing to drop to the floor so I could spend my last few minutes hugging myself in terror before the end. The man who looked like Santa Claus came out of the dormitory and smiled at me in a decidedly up the chimney he goes way. He said not a word, but went straight to his work, and as the hand scampered about like a long-nailed spider, he drew close and stopped just out of arm's reach. The owner of the hand stopped reaching, and I heard a wet noise that sounded like the worst head cold in history. The thing sniffed at the air like a man sucking up soup, and it said something that I'll never forget. I had to look up afterwards when I was in my right mind again, but it uttered a single muddy word before trying to pull his hand back. It said "Sacardos," and tried desperately to get his hand out of the hole. The old man shot his hand out as quick as a snake and gripped the wrist in a single gnarled old hand. The creature squealed, the scream too high to be called a scream, and the corridor was filled with a bright pulse of light. When it dimmed, I saw the arm now sitting on the floor below the window, and as we watched it, it disintegrated into something like oatmeal and sawdust. The creature went crazy, then its screams were full of terrible fury as it slammed its misshapen face into the window and gnashed its two big teeth at the little old man. He snapped a finger out then and booped the grotesque thing on its flat nose. In another bright flash, the creature was gone, little more than a greasy cloud in the space of the little window. Through the hole in the door, I could see the other two lumbering out into the hallway, streaked with gore and not even trying to hide their strangeness. I looked over at the little old man, standing placidly by the door. Some black substance had splashed onto his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. I started getting nervous around him the longer he stood there. The hellish creatures were trapped outside the room, but how dangerous was this seemingly harmless old man who'd reduced one of them to nothing with a flash of light? When you work with the homeless for long enough, you start to question things like miracles, or even the concept of change itself. This old man had just done something that I couldn't explain, and I felt like a piece in a game I didn't understand, a piece that was counter to the things outside I hoped. "Miss," he finally said, "I want you to release the doors and let me out into the hallway." I gaped at him. "Sir, those things will kill you. I've already watched them kill at least one person tonight, and I'm not in a hurry to watch them tear you apart too." He smiled at me in that Santa Claus way of his. I don't think so. I had wondered what brought me here tonight. When I found myself here at dusk, it appears that the powers that be knew where I would be most needed. I started to argue with him, but something in his eyes told me that he was going out there whether I wanted him to or not. I pushed the button, opened the door, and as he walked out, he said the last thing I'd ever hear him say: "You won't want to look." He strode toward the pair of them as I re-engaged the locks. Suddenly my eyes were assaulted by a flash of light like nothing I've ever seen before. I fell behind the door, shutting my stinging eyes, and I could hear other residents yelling in similar pain. The creatures screamed in agony and under that din, I could hear a sound like sizzling bacon as the old man went about his butcher's work. The whole thing lasted less than a minute, but it was a whole 10 minutes before I could see anything through my watering eyes. Standing shakily, I looked through the window hole and saw nothing but the empty corridor. No blood, no bodies except Janice's, and no evidence that any of them had been there. I called the police, and Mrs. Stone, who's responsible for the interests of our benefactors. The police arrived, and the ambulance they brought with them was a welcome sight. Janice pronounced dead at the scene, along with 10 others in the medical bay, Miss Chasterley among them. The medics said that it looked like an animal had attacked them, and big pieces of flesh had been torn out of them, along with some of their softer parts, throats, genitals, bellies, intestines, organs, and worst of all, their eyes had simply been devoured by whatever had attacked them. And no one was left alive to tell the police anything. The residents and I told them about the 3 men, omitting the old man. But the officers didn't seem to believe a monster had attacked us. They said it was likely a group of mentally unstable residents with masks that had a personal grudge against the shelter, and that out of shock had caused us to concoct the rest. Mrs. Stone arrived then, and I had to tell my story again, but I don't think she believed me either. I was given 2 weeks paid time off while the shelter was repaired, but I'll have to think long and hard about whether I want to return. The idea that this might happen again, and has likely happened before, chills me to the bone and makes me question everything I've ever believed in. Who was that old man? An angel? A messenger from God? A creature from space? And what does that make those things that attacked us? I've spent the last 3 nights trying to find forgetfulness at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Every time I close my eyes, I can still see those things, though, and I probably always will. I'm sharing this so some less equipped shelter workers will read it, and it might help them should this happen again. They came at night, they attacked our wounded first, and they killed without remorse. If I'd seen them on the street, I would have thought they were any other person in my neighbourhood, but their coats hid monsters like nothing I've ever experienced. If it happens to you, then I wish you luck. If they find you, then I hope the old man has found you first. The Sewer, posted by Erucius. When I was in high school, I had a job at the local fast food chain. I worked there for 4 years, freshman year, right up until I left for college, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have some good times there. Holidays were spent together because we didn't have much choice. Managers who were either good people or just entertaining to work with, co-workers who really became more like friends the longer you were there, and everything in between. I'm not going to say the whole 4 years was great, but it was an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything. Hell, I think that everyone should have to work fast food for at least a few months, because it gives you a little bit of perspective on the guy behind the hairnet. The chain I worked for was unique in many ways. They were one of the few who let people host events in the lobby. We had a small concert there once for a local metal band, which made for some entertaining times. They had a policy to hire 14-year-olds under special circumstances that got them into trouble more than once due to 14-year-old girls flirting with much older guys and led to alleged underage hookups in the back room. They had a weird rehabilitated cons program, the hired ex-cons, fresh from prison. That one worked pretty well until a couple of guys robbed the store after getting off shift and didn't even bother to take their name tags off. One of my favourites though was their open 24 hours program that they set up during the summer. Since I was under 18, I wasn't allowed to work past 10 on a school night, but during the summer I could work as late or as early as I wanted, and I took full advantage of it to fill my pockets with cash. As you may have guessed, this program added a third shift to the usual 2-shift schedule, and it was a 12-hour shift to boot. You'd come in at 6 PM just as the dinner rush was ramping up and work till 6 AM when the openers were coming in for their second cup of coffee. The hours were shit and the pay still wasn't great. No paid differential for late shifts, but what made it worthwhile was the 4-hour lull in between 1 AM and 5 AM. You might have to churn out some cheeseburgers or chicken nuggets for a bunch of drunk college kids or a carload of stoners, but for the most part you just kept the store clean and hung out. It was a light crew mostly, and on the night this story takes place I had a good bunch of guys with me. I'd gotten my friend a job there that year. We'll call him Ryan because he might read this. He and Trevor were on the grill that night. I was running the drive-through window and my favourite manager was watching the store, a guy named Joseph. Joseph was one of those rare managers that didn't have his head crammed up his arse and gave just enough of a shit to fly under the radar. He was a cool guy. I sometimes wonder whatever happened to him. Anyway, it had been a long night. The dinner rush was particularly bad, so as it starts to die down, we picked over the old food in the warmer box and went to the break room and hung out. Some managers frowned on this. Some would even write you up for it. But Joseph was cool and genuinely liked most of us that shared the third shift with him. The lobby doors were locked at midnight to keep the weirdos out, and with the headset turned up so I could hear a car roll in, we started eating old cheeseburgers and swapping stories. The stories started pretty blandly. This happened, or that thing someone had heard about, but finally we fell into creepy stories about stuff we'd experienced. I told them about the weirdo in our parking lot a few years ago who'd creeped a bunch of people out before the cops arrived and found his wife's head in the passenger seat along with a bloody machete. We thought he meant to rob or murder us, but it turned out he was just having a nervous breakdown in our parking lot after finally offing his old lady. Trevor tried to top it with his story about a time he'd been drinking with his cousins in a cornfield, but none of us believed it. He said the old farmer had come out of the cornfield, slasher flick style, and screamed at them to get off his property while chasing them with a pitchfork. We piled in the truck and sped off, but something hit the back tailgate hard. Well, we didn't stop till we got to my cousin's house, and what we saw when we got out was the last thing we expected, he said, pausing for dramatic effect. What was it? Said Ryan after Trevor had milked it for a little too long. A pitchfork. The guy had thrown a pitchfork and it stuck it right in the tailgate of the truck. If it'd been a little higher, it could have come through the rear window glass and took all three of us right in the back of the head. He paused again, like this should be some dramatic revelation, but Ryan and I both shared a look, like we doubted most of what had happened. When Joseph spoke up from the doorway, all three of us jumped. He'd been counting down the safe, so he hadn't been there for the start of the spooky stories, but it appeared he had come in at some time during Trevor's story and stopped to listen. Joseph was older than all three of us, a guy in his 30s with a wife and kids, but he often forgot that when we were hanging out because of how naturally he related to us. He was an avid gamer. He did all of the cool stuff we still hoped we were doing when we were adults. Right then, though, he had a decidedly dad look on his face as he assessed our little gathering of storytellers. I've got a story for you guys, he says, spinning a chair around, sitting in it with his arms folded over the back. And it's a true story too. You want to hear it? We did, and he began. I was working at the store near downtown at the time and living in this dingy little apartment with my wife. We were broke and she was pregnant and out on maternity leave. I was finishing up my bachelor's degree during the day, so nights were all I could count on to pay the bills. This was before the owners started up the third shift, or I'd have been all over that. So the 3 to 11 shift was all I had. We had a real hard-ass manager who kept us late almost every night, usually unpaid overtime, since we couldn't clean it right the first time apparently. So most nights I was lucky to get off by 12:30. The night in question had been especially bad, and I didn't get permission to leave until 1 in the morning. It was a Friday night though, so I knew I could sleep until right before my shift tomorrow if I needed to. Picking up my bag, I started trudging home through the chill January air. Now, I know it rarely gets cold here, being Florida and all, but that winter had been particularly bad. They had talked about snow more than once, and it had obliged by dumping a semi-solid sheet of slush all over the place the night before. Most of it was off the road, but the wind was howling at me as I pulled my coat tight and walked up the deserted centre of the road. Now downtown is usually party central unless you feel like driving to the beach, but tonight it was so cold that even the bars and coffee shops and all-night diners had shuttered their faces and gone to bed. The streetlights were on and the sewer gates were belching steam up into the cold night, and the whole scene looked pretty creepy to me. So I'm walking up the centre of the road, and there's a damn good reason I'm doing that too, in case you were wondering. I was made aware of Stephen King's It from a very young age, and it had given me a real phobia about sewer drains. I didn't want to walk too close, because even with all my hard-won 23 years of wisdom, I just knew that on a cold, lonely night like tonight, I would get a taloned hand around my ankle and a quick trip into the sewer if I stepped too close to the smoking holes. So I walked right up the centre of the street, as far from the gates as I could, and that particular night led me into trouble. So I'm walking up the centre line, boots clomping on the asphalt as I make my way through this too quiet street. That's when I hear a noise. I thought at first it was the sound of steam escaping from the grates. It was a hissing noise after all. But when it came again, I heard it for what it was. You remember in grade school when some kid behind you wants you to pass a note, so he'd do that psst sound at you to get your attention? Well, that's what the sound was, a psst sound from the left side of the road. So I turned around, but don't see anyone. I start walking again, and the same psst sound comes again from the left side of the road. I squinted at the dark alley between two buildings, getting ready to start flying if someone comes running out to mug me. But it's empty. That's when I heard it again. This time, someone says something in a low voice too. It sounded like, "Hey, buddy," followed by the psst sound again. Then I look down and I kid you not, there is a face in the drainage grate. As the steam comes curling up around it, I see a midnight black face looking out at me, and the only thing I can make out is his eyes. And they look fucking huge. I booked it. I started running, but as I run, I hear the voice behind me shouting for me to come back. Then I realise that the voice isn't behind me anymore. I glance to my left and see that it's following me from the opening to opening. Loud feet are slapping on the stones down there, and he's trying to get my attention when I hear him yell real loud and fall with a watery splash. I didn't slow in the least, but I saw the black ice a little too late. When I turned back to forward, I hit it and my feet shot straight up and out from underneath me. I fall back hard against the pavement, and I was pretty sure I'd almost broken my elbow when I came down hard on the concrete. At the time, I was trying to make my head stop spinning as the black spots danced around, and I struggled up to my elbow, wincing as I got up on my elbow. Just as the spots started going away, that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. "What?" I asked, unable to help myself, wrapped up so deeply until that moment I'd barely remembered to breathe. The manhole cover not 5 feet away was coming up, and a face is looking out at me. I tried to get up and slipped again as this dripping, oozing thing climbs out of the opening. He towers over me from my prone position, and I start pushing with my legs as I slid away from him. He comes out oozing and quivering from the dark tunnel, and in my mind he is the apotheosis of every shadowy creature from every horror movie I've ever seen. He's the creature from the Black Lagoon. He's it. He's the blob, and he's coming to drag me back down into the darkness so he can slowly devour me. His foot slaps down hard on the concrete as he menaces towards me. I'm still sliding away on my butt, my elbow starting to cry out now. When my low back hit the curb, I just froze there as this creature from the midnight cinema towered over me, its oozy flesh dripping onto the concrete. It takes large, ponderous steps as it moves in on me, and at this point I'm so gripped with fear I can't even move. Its flesh falls to the ground in gooey plops and after 1,000,000 years crammed into 5 seconds, it's standing not 3 feet away from me. It bends its mountainous head down toward me, and in a gravelly voice it says the last 3 words I would ever expect to hear from a creature like it. At this point, he looks at us, his mask of pent-up terror melting into the creepiest smile I've ever seen, as he gravels out, "Got a light." We sat dumbfounded for nearly 15 seconds before Trevor sputters, "What?" Joseph laughs. He asked if I had a light. It turns out he was a homeless guy who'd been living in the sewers to stay warm. He'd got himself a pry bar so he could hook the lid up and stayed in the sewers that night, where it was warm. He had no clue why it was so steamy down there, but it was a great place to sleep when the alternative was freezing your arse off in the park or down by the pier with the other vags. When I asked him why he was covered in what I hoped was mud, he said that he'd been chasing after me, trying to get a lighter to spark a cigarette, when he'd fallen into a muddy slush puddle and gotten covered in the stuff. I laughed and handed him the lighter. Out of my bag, an old Zippo my old man had given me, and considered it a fair trade for a great story. I've told that story so many times over the years, and it never gets old. We laughed about the story and Joseph's deadpan way of building it up until the final clincher for years to come, and I've begged him to retell it 100 times. So if you're ever downtown on a cold night and someone tries to get your attention from the closest sewer trench, remember that it's probably some vagrant trying to stay warm and have a smoke. And if they drag you down there into the sewer for a slow process of digestion, then I guess I was wrong, wasn't I? And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed these stories and have some creepy stories of your own, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Good night, my little hellhounds.